Okay, so just to add on with the secondary survey, and I touched on head injuries during the secondary survey. There's three main types of head injuries. There's concussion, compression, and fractures. So concussion is what quite a few people have experienced. Concussion is basically brain shake. If you put an egg in a cup and then shake it, it gets damaged, and that's pretty much what happens with brain shake. Okay. With concussion, classic signs and symptoms would be a headache. There might be a little bit confusion, not sure where they are. This is why you ask her, do you know what day it is? Do you know where you are? They may well be a bit confused, okay? Concussion is not in itself a serious injury, but it can sometimes be misdiagnosed. Now the problem with concussion, you can't diagnose concussion until after the event and it's been monitored. Now quite often, if anybody's ever been to hospital with a head injury, they like to keep you and monitor you for at least 4 hours as a minimum, sometimes overnight, and what they're looking for is changes in your behaviour. Anytime you go to hospital with a head injury, the first thing the doctor will do, stick a torch in your eyes, and that's to see that you've got good pupil reaction. Interestingly enough, I only found this fact out a few years ago, and it's quite interesting to notice, they'll do this thing with the torch where they'll take it through both eyes. Now if you put the hand here and you shine a torch in this eye, the pupil gets small. The pupil on this side also gets small, even though it's not getting light in it, because your eyes work simultaneously. Now a good sign of a head injury is if they shine the torch in this eye doesn't react. That's an indication there's something going wrong, okay? So torch in the eye is the first thing. Levels of response I touched on. The two main injuries where levels of response are affected in casualties are head injuries and losing blood, a lot of blood, i.e. hypovolemic shock. Always talking to casualty. Now I demonstrated with Martin as a conscious responsive casualty. I told him what I was doing throughout the secondary survey. I was explaining, I'm searching your chest for any injuries. Even though he said I don't have any injuries, just my left leg, quite commonly people don't feel all the injuries, so you don't assume that's the only injury they've got. They might not realise they've got more significant injuries, so it's really important that we check. So I mentioned concussion. Now the other two injuries that you're going to be aware of are compression and fractures. Now if somebody's got a fractured skull, there are certain classic signs and symptoms. Fractured skull, around the brain you have the skull. Between the skull and the brain you have this little bag called the cerebellum. And within that bag you have this fluid called cerebral fluid, which is a clear fluid. When the skull is fractured, that clear fluid escapes from the head via the ears or the nose. Now the problem is when it surfaces from the nose and the ears, it's straw coloured, so almost like the colour of that wall. Now it's that colour because it's a cerebral fluid that's escaped from around the brain, and it's got flakes of blood in it, and that's what gives it that straw-like appearance. So if you see that coming out the ears or the nose, that is a classic sign they've got a skull fracture. Now if it's a skull fracture on the frontal lobe, it's not uncommon to see black eyes, two black eyes. It's referred to as raccoon eyes or panda eyes. Now these are normally, when you get a bruise, it takes a couple of hours for it to come up. With a head injury, it comes up extremely quickly. So you'll instantly see this bruising coming up. That is classic skull fracture along the front of the skull, okay? Now the other one, now if you remember Liam Neeson, famous Hollywood actor, his wife, Natasha Richardson, died from a skull fracture to the base of the skull, but what actually killed her was a compression injury. And what happened is she fell over on the ski slope, banged the back of her head and fractured the skull at the base of the skull. She ended up with a compression style injury. Now what a compression injury is where you get bleeding on the brain. Now unfortunately, because it's an encased thing in the brain, it's within the skull, the blood had nowhere to go. So what happens is the blood builds up and up and up and starts putting pressure on the brain itself. That affects your eyesight, it affects your levels of response, it affects all sorts of things. You get a severe headache. Now the problem is with compression injuries, very common in rugby players as well. Common problem is it's not diagnosed correctly early on, and it can be literally a couple of days later when they're complaining of really severe headache and they've actually got a compression injury, okay? So there was a famous chef, I can't remember what his name was, Nigel, I can't remember his surname, fell over in the shower, banged his head, he died a day and a half later, and that was a compression injury he died from. So he had a build-up, he had a bleed on the brain, and that's what killed him, compression. It's a very dangerous condition. And that's why, even though somebody's been taken into hospital, they get observed, and then they're given, when they're released, they're given an A4 sheet. If you suffer any of these symptoms, you come straight back to hospital. And that's where they'll do MRIs and CAT scans on the brain to make sure there's no issues in the brain cavity. As I said, fractures at the base of the skull, bruising behind the ears, sometimes called battle marks. But if you get bruising behind the ears, that's classic. And that's what Natasha Richardson would have had, bruising behind her ears. That's borne out through the skull fracture at the base of the skull, and also a build-up of fluid. Now, the other medical condition that you get is swelling of the brain. Now, again, if the brain is swelling, this is quite common where people are hit by cars or come off motorbikes and stuff, severe head trauma, the brain starts to swell, but it's got nowhere to go. So what they do at hospital is they cut a section of the skull out and allow the brain to swell outside of the head, but they're generally put into an induced coma for that. That's not something as first aiders we start doing. We don't start cracking people's head open and, yeah, don't worry, you'll be sorted. We don't do that. All we do are look for the classic symptoms of a head injury. Eyes not responding to light, significant swelling or bruising, method of the injury, what's actually happened. They've just fallen from that roof up there, 2 stories high, and landed on the head. Massive, big hematoma, big swelling on the head. That's going to be a head injury. Now, any significant head injuries, you always treat for a neck or back injury. So a spinal injury as well. So any head injuries, always treat for, especially if they're unresponsive. If it's hard enough to render them unresponsive, it's hard enough to damage their neck and their back. So they must be treated as though they've got a spinal injury, and that means securing the head. Now, you'll notice when I secured this Martin's head when I was doing the treatment, I made sure I didn't cover his ears. So my thumbs went above the ears, fingers cradling the back of the head and the side of the head. So I didn't cover his ears, so that way he could still hear me when I was talking to him. Very, very important. And then it's about keeping the head in line with the body. So you heard me say to Martin several times, don't move your head. And in the end, I'd secured it because I wasn't comfortable that he would keep his head still.